Prior to the 19th century, the Indian textile industry operated on a massive global scale. The sheer quality of the goods produced a supreme confidence among British colonial administrators. In 1772, company official Henry Patullo stated that the demand for Indian textiles could never reduce because no other nation produced goods of the same quality. This was the prevailing logic. They assumed superior craftsmanship alone guaranteed permanent market dominance, leaving them entirely blind to the systemic economic shifts that were already brewing. Relying on that single metric of physical quality created a false sense of security. It left the company completely unprepared for a very different kind of industrial economic war. While London boardrooms projected unwavering optimism, the reality on the ground in regions like Carnatic and Bengal was already fraying long before the turn of the century. Early fractures were showing in the trade. Weavers deserted their villages, migrating to set up looms in distant settlements with family just to keep fed. Resistance began locally. Weavers and village traders pushed back against the company. They refused to accept loans, intentionally shuttered their workshops, and abandoned their looms entirely to work the fields as agricultural laborers. The colonial pressures had forced the traditional Indian textile economy into a state of internal collapse, long before the first external shock of British industrialization ever arrived. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, England was rapidly developing its own domestic cotton industries. But British industrial groups soon realized they could not compete with the quality of Indian imports on the open market. Facing severe financial pressure, they organized and pushed their government to intervene. Parliament responded by imposing steep protectionist import duties on cotton textiles. The legislation was designed to strictly block Indian goods, ensuring Manchester products could sell within Britain without facing any outside competition. This chart displays the exact statistical outcome of those tariffs. In the period of 1811 to 1812, piece goods accounted for 33% of all Indian exports. By 1850, that figure had plummeted to barely 3%. The dismantling of the Indian export market was a legislative victory first. Political lobbying and border taxes, rather than technological superiority, delivered the opening blow. Shutting down the export channels created one crisis, but cotton weavers in India suddenly found themselves facing two problems at exactly the same time. As their overseas buyers vanished, their local domestic market shrunk. At the same time, tariffs went up in London. British industrialists persuaded the East India Company to act as a funnel, aggressively selling cheap, machine-made British manufactures directly into Indian markets. This area chart visualizes the scale of that import flood. At the end of the 18th century, there was virtually no import of cotton piece goods into India. By 1850, those British goods constituted over 31% of the value of Indian imports. By the 1870s, they crossed the 50% mark. The weavers were now trapped in a carefully engineered economic vice. They were blocked by law from selling abroad, while being severely undercut on price in their own towns by machines operating thousands of miles away. Behind those macroeconomic percentages was a localized human devastation that colonial administrators documented directly. Writing about the regions of Janabad and Bihar, the Commissioner of Patna observed that a brisk trade in the manufacture of cloth had entirely ceased. The native manufacturers simply could not compete with the cheap, durable goods pouring in from Manchester. Further documentation appears in the 1872 census report regarding the Kosis, a specific community of weavers. The colonial record states quite plainly that they had fallen upon evil times. Unable to match the sheer volume of Manchester's showy goods, the report details that these weavers were forced to emigrate in great numbers, largely to Berar, to survive on the wages of common day laborers. The rapid expansion and prosperity of the Industrial Revolution in Britain was subsidized by the systematic impoverishment and de-industrialization of colonial India. Then, in the 1860s, a sudden external shock hit. The outbreak of the American Civil War instantly severed global supply lines, cutting off Britain from its primary source of U.S. cotton. Desperate to keep massive mills running, British manufacturers turned hungrily toward India for raw cotton. As raw cotton exports out of India accelerated, domestic supply evaporated, causing local prices to skyrocket. Indian weavers, already battered by the flood of British imports, were now entirely starved of supplies. Forced to buy raw materials at exorbitant, inflated prices, the actual act of weaving became a path to financial ruin. The colonial economic model operated on a clear hierarchy. Extracting raw resources to feed the metropole always took priority over the survival of domestic Indian manufacturing. As the inland artisan communities fell into absolute ruin, coastal trading ports like Bombay and Calcutta were simultaneously experiencing a period of booming growth. The massive expansion of these ports, filled with large steamships and high-volume cargo, marked the definitive death of the old trading order, permanently cementing a modernized colonial export economy in its place. The wealth visibly accumulating in these coastal hubs was a direct mathematical result of the collapse of the traditional craftsmen inland. By the end of the 19th century, weavers and other craftspeople faced one final, insurmountable hurdle. Factories located inside India began their own mass production, flooding the local markets with a new wave of domestic machine nodes. Squeezed by overseas tariffs, overwhelmed by import floods, starved of raw materials, and finally undercut by local industrial factories, how could the traditional weaving industries possibly survive?